There is a kind of ground that holds its own weather. You feel it in the Kentucky Pennyroyal, where the limestone runs close under the soil and the rain goes down instead of across. In the spring of 1891, a preacher rode into a hollow in that ground and found a chapel with no windows and a floor that had been cut clean away. I read what he wrote about what was beneath those boards, and I want to tell it to you the way it came to him. It's not a ghost story, and I want you to sit with that before we go any further. A note before this one begins. If the kind of case I tell here is the kind you would want to hold in your hands, the actual depositions, the ledgers, the parish records, I have gathered 7 of them into a dossier, the Appalachian dossier, 7 files withdrawn from county record between 1843 and 1891, restored exactly as the clerk copied them. You will find the link in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now then, the story. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from tonight and drop it in the comments. I read every one of them. And there's something honest about knowing you and I are sitting in different rooms in different countries, listening to the same old voice talk about something that should have stayed buried. Now lean back, get comfortable, because what I'm about to tell you took place in the spring of 1891 on the southern edge of the Pennyroyal Plateau in a hollow that doesn't sit on any map you would find today. His name was Josiah Webb, and he was a circuit rider. I want you to understand what that meant in 1891, because by then it didn't mean much. The circuit rider system started 100 years earlier, when the Methodist Church sent men on horseback across the American frontier to preach in places that had no churches and no resident pastors. These men rode routes called circuits, carrying everything they owned in saddlebags, sleeping in whatever cabin would take them, eating whatever was put in front of them. They baptized children and married couples and buried the dead, and they moved on. A circuit took 2 to 4 weeks to ride, and when you finished it, you turned around and rode it again. By 1891, the frontier was closed. The census had confirmed it the year before. Railroads connected towns that used to take days to reach on horseback, and most Methodist congregations had resident pastors now, men who lived in one place and preached from a pulpit that didn't move. The circuit rider was becoming a relic, a figure from a time that the country was already beginning to romanticize and forget. Josiah Webb didn't romanticize it. He was 53 years old that spring, and he had been riding circuits since he was 22. His body knew the roads, the way your hands know a tool you have held for 30 years. Not map knowledge, but body knowledge. The accumulated record of footsteps and weather, and the specific quality of light at different hours. He had a horse named Covenant, and a pair of saddlebags that held a Bible, a circuit book, 2 changes of clothes, and a tin cup. He had a knee that locked in cold weather, and a scar on his left palm where a man had cut him with a knife during a dispute over a baptism in 1874. He didn't talk about the scar. He didn't talk about much. His circuit that spring covered 4 counties in the southern Pennyroyal, and it carried a list of congregations he was responsible for visiting. Most of them he had been visiting for years. He knew the families, the elders, the children who had been born since he started riding. He knew which hollows had good water and which ones had wells that went bad in the dry season. He knew the ground. And one of the congregations on his list hadn't sent word in over a year. The hollow was called Gideon. It sat in the southern reaches of the Pennyroyal, past the last railroad stop, past the last county road that a wagon could travel in any season. The last report from Gideon Hollow was a single line in the circuit book, written by Webb himself after his visit the previous spring. All well, the Lord is with us. Then nothing. No letter, no request for a visit, no death notice, just silence. Webb told himself there were reasons for that. The hollow was hard to reach, and the people there were private, and mail service in that part of the Pennyroyal was unreliable. He told himself a great many reasonable things, and every one of them was true, and not one of them was the truth. And I think some part of him already knew the difference, because when he turned Covenant south on the road out of Bowling Green that April morning, he rode with his Bible in his lap instead of in his saddlebag. The ground changed on the second day. Webb had been riding south through rolling farmland, green fields and fenced pastures and creeks that ran on the surface the way creeks are supposed to. But as the road narrowed and the fences gave out and the last farm fell behind him, the ground began to change. The soil thinned. He could see it in the road cuts, where the reddish clay gave way to pale gray stone that looked like old bone. The trees changed too. The hardwoods thinned out, and the cedars came in, dense and dark and low, growing straight out of the rock where there should not have been enough dirt to hold a root. And the ground developed depressions. The first one he passed was shallow, maybe 10 feet across, a gentle saucer in the earth that held a pool of standing water the color of tea. He rode around it without thinking. The second one was deeper, 20 feet across, with trees tilted inward at the edges, their trunks leaning toward the center like they were being slowly pulled underground. Covenant snorted and sidestepped, and Webb let the horse pick its own path. This is what Karst looks like when you're standing in it. The limestone under the soil has been dissolving for thousands of years, and the ground above it has been sinking and collapsing into the spaces left behind. The water doesn't stay on the surface. It goes down through cracks and fissures and openings that appear without warning, and it carves channels and rooms and passages underneath the soil that nobody can see from above. In the Pennyroyal, the ground isn't solid. It's a skin stretched over hollow stone, and the skin is always settling, always thinning, always opening. Webb knew this ground differently than a flatland preacher would, because he had felt it shift under his horse on other circuits. He had seen a barn disappear into a sinkhole in Edmonson County in 1886, the whole structure dropping 8 feet in a single night, the mule inside gone and never found. He had preached at a church in Hart County where the cemetery had developed a hole between 2 graves that went down 30 feet into a chamber that smelled like wet chalk and cold air. He knew the Pennyroyal, and he knew what the ground could do, and he rode carefully. The trail into Gideon Hollow followed a creek for the first few miles, a thin stream that ran clear and steady over a bed of gravel. Webb noted the creek in his account because of what happened to it. About 2 miles before the ridge that marked the hollow, the creek narrowed and the water gathered speed, and then the creek bed simply ended. The water poured into a crack in the limestone and was gone. The bed below the crack was dry, white gravel and pale stone, and not a drop of water touched it. Webb sat on Covenant and watched the stream disappear into the ground, and he wrote later that the sound of the water going down was the sound of something being swallowed. He crossed the ridge in the late afternoon. The sun was low, and the light was the color of old brass, and when he crested the top and looked down into the hollow, he could see buildings. 6 or 7 structures in a loose cluster at the bottom of the valley, log walls and shingled roofs, set among garden plots and fence lines that had gone to weed. And at the center of the cluster, on a slight rise that put it above the rest, there was a building he didn't recognize as a church. It was a log structure, single room, no steeple and no bell. But it had no windows. The walls were solid log from the ground to the roof line, with only a door on the south side and a narrow gap near the peak where the ridge beam met the wall. And the ground around the building was wrong. Webb could see it, even from the ridge, 100 yards above. The earth around the chapel was depressed, a circular sag in the ground, maybe 40 feet across, centered on the building. The chapel sat in the depression like a cork pressed into the mouth of a bottle, and the logs at its base were stained with mineral deposits, white and orange, as if water had been rising and falling around them for years. Webb sat on Covenant at the top of the ridge and looked at the hollow for a long time. He wrote that the light was failing, and the buildings below looked like a woodcut, all edges and shadow, and that the chapel in particular looked like something that had been drawn by a hand that didn't quite understand what a church was for. He descended into Gideon Hollow in the last hour of daylight. The trail down was overgrown, with saplings growing in the ruts and honeysuckle crawling across the path, but it was still passable. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't happened because the road was washed out. The first thing he noticed was the quiet. I want you to understand what I mean by that, because it's not the quiet of an empty place. An empty place is just absence. You walk into a house that nobody has lived in for years, and the quiet is the quiet of dust and dead air and nothing happening. This was different. This was the quiet of a room you have just walked into where two people were talking and stopped the moment they saw you. It was a held quiet, a waiting quiet. The hollow wasn't empty. It was listening. Webb tied Covenant to a post near the first cabin and walked through the settlement on foot. There were 6 cabins, arranged along the creek bed on either side of the chapel. All of them were abandoned, not ruined or burned or torn apart, but simply left. He looked through the door of the first one and saw a table set for a meal, plates and cups and a chair pushed back from the table as if someone had stood up in the middle of eating and walked out. The second cabin had a bed still made, a quilt folded at the foot, and a pair of boots sitting by the door, laces untied, waiting to be put on. The third had a shelf of jars, canned beans, and preserved peaches, the seals still intact. Whatever had driven the people out of Gideon Hollow, they had left in a way that suggested they expected to come back. He found no signs of violence anywhere, no blood or bullet holes or scorch marks, no graves. The cabins had been left the way you leave a house when you're going to the neighbor's for an hour, and the hour turns into the rest of your life. The chapel sat at the center of the hollow, on a low rise that put it about 10 feet above the cabins. He walked up to it in the gray light and stood at the door. The building was maybe 20 feet by 25, log construction, the kind of thing a community builds when they have axes and time, but no money. The logs were hand-hewn, fitted tight, chinked with clay and stone. The roof was shake, weathered gray, sagging slightly at the center. There was no cross on the ridge beam, no bell, no sign. The depression in the ground around the chapel was more pronounced up close. The earth sloped down toward the building on all sides, a gentle but visible sag, as if the ground beneath the chapel had settled and dragged the surrounding soil down with it. The foundation logs sat in a ring of pale mineral deposits, the same white and orange staining he had seen from the ridge, and when he crouched and touched the stain, it was gritty, like chalk mixed with rust. The door was a single plank of oak, rough sawn, hung on leather hinges. It was closed, but not latched. Webb put his hand on it and felt the air on the other side, and the air was cold. Not shade cold, not evening cold, a different cold, steady and damp, coming from somewhere below the floor. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the wood, and then he pushed the door open. The inside of the chapel was a single room, and the first thing Webb saw was the floor. The floor was wrong, and everything else he noticed after that he noticed because of the floor. But I'm going to tell it the way he wrote it, in the order it came to him, because the order matters. The room was plain, log walls, plank floor, a rough pulpit at the far end built from a single board laid across 2 sawhorses. There were wooden benches, 8 or 10 of them, the kind you build when you need seating and you don't care about comfort, just boards on a frame, no backs, no padding. The walls were bare, no scripture, no cross, no hymn board. The only light came from the open door and the narrow gap at the peak of the roof, and in that light the room looked like the inside of a box that someone had built and then forgotten to put windows in. The first wrong thing was the benches. A chapel pulpit stands at the far end of the room, and the benches face it, because that's how a church works. The preacher stands at the front, and the people sit and face the preacher. But in this chapel, the benches had been moved. They were arranged in a circle around the center of the room, facing inward, turned away from the pulpit. The pulpit stood at the far wall, like a piece of furniture nobody wanted anymore. Whatever the congregation had been looking at, it wasn't the pulpit. The second wrong thing was the walls. At about chest height, the logs had been carved. Not written on, not painted, carved with a knife or a chisel, grooves cut into the wood in repeating patterns. Horizontal lines and vertical lines, some grouped in sets of 4 or 5, others in longer runs that stretched across an entire log. Some of the grooves were pale, the wood still fresh and light where the bark had been cut away. Others were dark, aged to the same gray as the surrounding wood, so old that the cuts had weathered nearly smooth. Whatever had been carved here had been carved over a long time, by different hands, in the same patterns. The third wrong thing was the air. When Webb stepped through the door, the cold hit his face. It was April, and the day outside had been warm, maybe 60 degrees, the kind of spring day in Kentucky when the dogwoods are out, and the ground is soft and the air smells like mud and new growth. Inside the chapel, the air was 50 degrees or colder, and it was moving. Not a draft, not a breeze. A steady, slow current of air rising from below, carrying the smell of wet limestone and still water, and something older than either, the smell of stone that has never been dry. Webb stood in the doorway for a long time. He wrote that he stood there because the cold kept him from wanting to go in, and because the smell reminded him of the church in Hart County where the cemetery had opened up, and because something about the arrangement of the benches drew his stomach tight in a way he couldn't explain. He told himself the building was built over a spring, which happens in the Pennyroyal, and the cold air was just the spring breathing through the gaps in the floor. He told himself the benches had been rearranged by children, or by someone who had used the building for storage after the congregation left. And then he ran out of things to tell himself. And then he looked down at the floor in the center of the room, where the benches faced, and he saw that the floor wasn't there. The floorboards in the center of the chapel had been cut away, not rotted, not collapsed, not fallen through from age or weight, cut with a saw. The edges were clean and straight, the saw marks still visible in the grain, and the opening was a deliberate rectangle, maybe 8 feet by 6, centered exactly where the benches faced. Someone had taken a saw to their own church floor and removed a section of it on purpose. And they had done it carefully, and they had arranged their seating around the result. Webb walked to the edge of the opening and looked down. The void went down past the range of the dim light. The walls of the opening were pale stone, limestone, wet and streaked with the same mineral deposits that marked the foundation logs outside. The edges where the floorboards had been cut showed the cross-section of the ground beneath the chapel, a thin layer of soil on top of solid limestone, and below the limestone, the stone dropped away into a natural cavity that extended down and out in directions he couldn't follow. He stood at the edge and dropped a stone into the opening. He counted the seconds, the way you count seconds when you're waiting for something to happen, and the waiting is the only sound. He counted 1, 2, 3, 4. The stone struck something below, and the sound that came back wasn't a single impact, but a series of smaller reports, a click and a skip and a rattle, as if the stone had hit a shelf and bounced, and kept falling into a space larger than the opening suggested. He estimated the depth at 100 feet or more, but he wrote that the estimate felt wrong even as he made it, because the sound kept going after the stone should have stopped. And then there was the other sound. The void breathed. Air moved through it in slow, irregular currents, the way air moves through a cave system when the temperature outside changes, and the pressure differential pushes and pulls through the passages. The movement created a sound, and the sound wasn't wind and not water, but something between the two, a low, continuous murmur that rose and fell without pattern. Webb describes it in his account as the sound of voices heard through a wall, just below the threshold of words. You know someone is speaking. You can't make out what they're saying. The cold coming up from the opening was constant. Webb writes that the temperature inside the chapel was 10 or 15 degrees below the April air outside, and that the draft from the void was the source of it. The air rose from the opening in a steady column, cold and damp, and it filled the room the way water fills a bowl, from the bottom up. His horse, tied outside the door, pulled at its rope the entire time he was inside. His account notes that Covenant never settled, never stopped turning his head toward the door, never stopped trying to leave. Webb sat down on one of the benches beside the opening and listened. He writes that he sat there for what he estimated was an hour, though he also writes that time moved strangely inside the chapel, and that the cold and the sound and the dim light made it hard to hold on to the difference between 10 minutes and 30. The murmur didn't stop. It didn't change pitch or rhythm. It was the same continuous sound the entire time he sat there, as if the ground below the chapel was talking to itself, and had been talking for a very long time, long before the chapel was built, long before there were people in the hollow to hear it. He writes one more thing about that hour, and I want you to sit with it. He records that the sound wasn't unpleasant. His account says that after the first few minutes, the murmur became something he could almost lean into, the way you lean into the sound of rain on a roof when you're lying in bed and the room is dark. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't harsh. It was the sound of something very old and very patient, and it was speaking in a register that his body recognized before his mind did. He left the chapel when the light outside began to fail. He writes that he walked out the door and the April air hit him like a wall, warm and bright and alive, and he stood in the doorway and breathed it in and felt the cold leaving his skin in layers, the way you feel warmth returning to your hands after you have been holding ice. He returned to the cabins. He was looking for a record, any record, something that would tell him who these people were and what had happened to them, and why the floor of their church had been cut open to the dark. He found it in the third cabin, under a bed, in a wooden box the size of a sermon case. The box held a parish register, a small leather-bound book, and a bundle of letters tied with twine. The parish register was the record of the Gideon Hollow congregation, and it began in 1873, the year the first families settled the hollow. The early entries were in the hand of a man named Amos Creed, who appeared to have been the first elder of the congregation. The handwriting was careful and formal, the letters squared and precise, the kind of penmanship a man learns when he has been taught to keep records and takes the work seriously. The first entries read like any rural Methodist congregation in the Pennyroyal: baptisms, marriages, deaths, Sunday service attendance. The register shows that 4 families came to Gideon Hollow from eastern Tennessee in the spring of 1873, looking for farmland. They built the chapel in 1874, the same year they formally petitioned the circuit rider for regular visits. For the first 5 years, the entries are ordinary. Hymns are listed by number, scripture readings are recorded by chapter and verse. Revivals are held in the spring and the fall. Children are baptized. A woman named Sarah Creed dies of fever in 1876 and is buried behind the chapel. The world is normal. The shift begins in 1879. The entries don't stop, but they change. Amos Creed's handwriting becomes less formal, the letters looser, the lines drifting down the page. The baptisms stop. The marriage entries stop. Sunday attendance is still recorded, but the numbers don't change, because the same people are coming every week, and no one new has arrived. Instead of listing hymns and scripture, the entries describe something else. The gathering at the opening. The listening. The night of the deep silence. The 7th evening of the mouth. In 1881, there's an entry that records the cutting of the floor. Creed writes that the congregation discovered the void beneath the chapel in the winter of 1880, when a section of floor gave way during a Sunday service. No one was hurt. The opening was small at first, a crack in the boards that widened over a week until a man could look down into the stone below. Creed writes that they didn't fill the hole. They enlarged it. They took a saw to the floorboards and cut a clean rectangle, 8 feet by 6, and they moved the benches into a circle around it. He calls the opening the mouth, and writes, in a hand that's still careful but no longer formal, that the congregation believed the void wasn't empty. It was waiting. The entries continue through the 1880s. They grow shorter. The descriptions of the gatherings become repetitive, as if Creed was recording the same event every week and the event didn't change. The congregation gathered at the mouth and listened. The sound continued. No one spoke. Occasionally, a longer entry appears, and these are the ones the narrator returns to, because they're the ones where Creed tries to put into words what the congregation heard. One entry from 1885 reads, "The sound isn't wind. The sound isn't water. The sound is the stone speaking. And the stone has been speaking since before the Lord made the world, and I think the Lord made the world on top of the stone, because the stone was already there. The last entry in the register is dated October 1889. It's 3 lines, in Creed's hand, and the writing is shaky and uneven, the letters listing to the right as if the pen was being held by someone who was cold or tired or both. The mouth has spoken. We have heard what it said. We go down to listen more closely. After that, the pages are blank. Before I go any further, let me ask you something. Tell me if you have ever read a line in an old record that made you set the book down and sit there for a while, not because you didn't understand it, but because you understood it too well. Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them. And if you want to hold the documents I'm describing tonight, the register and the letters and the flyleaf account, they're part of the Appalachian Dossier, the same collection I mentioned at the start. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Now let me take you back to it. Now, you have to understand something about how I'm telling you this, because if I just read you those 3 lines and stopped, you would think this is a story about people who went crazy in a hollow and walked into a hole in the ground. And maybe it is. But there are the letters, and the letters are what make this something else. The letters were correspondence between Amos Creed and a circuit rider named Brother Paulus, who had been assigned to the Gideon Hollow circuit before Webb. Paulus visited the hollow in the spring of 1885, the same year Creed wrote the entry about the stone speaking, and he stayed for 3 days. His letters to Creed, written over the 4 years that followed, fill in the gap between the cutting of the floor and the last entry in the register. Paulus was 31 when he visited Gideon Hollow, and he had been riding circuits for 6 years. He wasn't a dramatic man, and his letters are not dramatic letters. They're the letters of a young preacher who found something he didn't understand and tried to address it through the channels available to him, which were patience, correspondence, and the occasional firm suggestion. His first letter, written 2 weeks after his visit, describes what he found. When he arrived, the chapel had already been modified. The benches were in a circle, the pulpit was unused, the floor was open, and the congregation, about 20 people, men and women, all adults, gathered around the opening every evening and sat in silence, listening to the void. Paulus writes that he asked Creed about the opening, and Creed told him the history, the same history the register records. Paulus then asked Creed about the worship, and this is where the letters become the thing I keep coming back to. Creed told Paulus that the congregation had stopped using the Bible, not banned it, not burned it, not rejected it in anger. They had simply stopped opening it. The Scripture, Creed said, spoke of a God above, a God of sky and light and things that grow upward. The opening spoke of a God below, a God of stone and depth and things that have been there since before the sky was made. The congregation had decided that the God below was older and more honest because it didn't require faith. You could hear it. You could feel its breath on your face. It was there in a way that the God of the book wasn't. Paulus tried to preach. He stood at the pulpit on the Sunday of his visit and read from the Gospel of John, the passage about the light shining in the darkness. He records that the congregation sat politely and listened, and when he finished, they thanked him, and then they returned to the opening and resumed their listening. They weren't hostile. They weren't dismissive. They were kind, the way you're kind to a guest who has come to your house and doesn't understand the customs. Creed told Paulus, gently, that he was welcome to stay, but that the congregation no longer needed a preacher. They had found what the preacher was supposed to lead them to, Creed said, and the finding hadn't come from a book. It had come from the ground. Paulus left after 3 days. His letters to Creed over the next 4 years grow shorter and more strained. He asks Creed to reconsider. He asks him to fill in the floor and return the benches to their proper arrangement, and resume the hymns and the Scripture. He reminds Creed of his obligations to the conference and to the families in the hollow. Creed's replies are brief and calm and don't address Paulus's concerns directly. They read like the letters of a man who has moved past the conversation and is being polite about it. In 1887, Paulus writes to Creed and asks him directly what he hears when he sits at the opening. Creed's reply is the longest of the surviving letters, and it's the one I want you to hold on to. He writes, I hear what you heard, Paulus, when you sat with us that first evening. You didn't stay long enough to name it, but you heard it. The sound isn't wind. It's the sound of something. Not water. It's the sound of something that was here before us and will be here after us. And it's not silent, and it's not random, and it's speaking in a way that takes time to understand. We have taken the time. You didn't. The last letter in the bundle is from Paulus, dated March 1888. It's 4 lines. I have requested a transfer from the circuit. I won't return to Gideon Hollow. I have told the conference that the congregation has disbanded, because I don't know what else to tell them. I pray that you're well, and I pray that I'm wrong about what I heard. The conference didn't send another rider. The Hollow was listed as inactive, and the circuit was redrawn, and Gideon Hollow dropped off the books. That's how it stayed until Josiah Webb found the name on an old circuit list 3 years later and decided to ride down and see for himself. Webb returned to the chapel on the second night. He writes that he couldn't sleep because the sound from the void carried through the walls of the cabin he was lying in, a low vibration that was less a sound than a pressure, the way you feel a train pass before you hear it. He dressed and walked across the hollow in the dark, and pushed the chapel door open and sat down on a bench beside the opening. He listened for 2 hours. His horse was tied outside, and Covenant pulled at the rope the entire time, but Webb didn't leave. In his account, written later in pencil on the flyleaf of his circuit Bible, he describes the sound in more detail than he gave in his initial notes. His account describes the murmur as having a structure to it, not words, not language, not anything that could be transcribed or repeated, but a rhythm, a rising and falling that feels intentional, the way breathing is intentional, the way a heartbeat is intentional. He compares it to the sound of a congregation praying under their breath, heard from outside a closed church door. You know they're speaking. You can hear the cadence of speech, the rise and fall of voices saying words you can't make out. And then he writes one line that I have read more times than I can count, and that I still don't fully understand. He writes, I don't think the sound comes from water. I don't think it comes from wind. I think it comes from the stone itself, and I think the stone has been making it for longer than there have been people to hear it. He doesn't write what Creed wrote. He doesn't say the mouth spoke to him. He doesn't say that he understood what the congregation understood, or that he felt the presence of anything divine or unholy. He says only that he sat and listened, and that the cold rose from the opening and covered his hands and his face, and that when he finally stood to leave, the sound didn't stop. He understood that it wouldn't stop. It had been going on before the chapel was built, and it would go on after the chapel was gone. And his sitting beside it for 2 hours in the dark hadn't changed it, and couldn't change it, the way standing beside a river doesn't change the river. Webb rode out of Gideon Hollow the next morning. He didn't fill in the floor. He didn't burn the register or the letters. He took them with him, along with his notes, and he packed them in his saddlebag beside his Bible. He recorded the visit in his circuit book with a single line, the last entry he ever recorded for Gideon Hollow. Gideon Hollow, no congregation remaining, chapel standing, see flyleaf. He didn't write what he thought it meant. He didn't write whether he believed Creed or Paulus or neither. He wrote only what he saw and what he heard, and he let it stand. Webb's circuit Bible, with the flyleaf account in pencil, passed to his daughter after his death in 1903. He died in a boarding house in Glasgow, Kentucky, from a fever that took him in 4 days. His daughter kept the Bible in a drawer for 30 years, and when she died, it moved to a private collection in Louisville, and from there to another collection in Lexington, where I read it. The parish register and the letters traveled with it, tied in the same twine in the same wooden box. Gideon Hollow was never resettled. The cabins collapsed over the next 2 decades, their roofs falling in, their walls sagging outward, the logs returning to the soil they came from. By the 1920s, the hollow was overgrown. the garden plots buried under honeysuckle and sassafras, the fence lines swallowed by the woods. If you walked through it then, you wouldn't have known that anyone had lived there.
The chapel lasted longer than the cabins, because log buildings are stubborn things, and the workmanship was good. But the ground beneath it wasn't done. In the spring of 1906, 15 years after Webb's visit, the sinkhole expanded. The depression around the chapel deepened, and the foundation logs on the south side began to tilt. And over the course of a single rainy week in April, the entire structure slid into the opening. The roof fell first, then the walls, then the floor with its sawn rectangle, and the whole chapel folded into the earth like a box breaking apart in a current. A surveyor passing through the area in 1908 noted a collapsed building in a sink and marked it on a county map with a small X, which is the only official record that the chapel ever existed. The void is still there. I have stood at the edge of it. The site is a wooded depression in the Pennyroyal, unmarked, reachable only by foot, a quarter-mile from the nearest road, and a mile from anything you would call a town. The opening that was once inside the chapel is now exposed to the sky, a jagged mouth in the limestone, maybe 12 feet across, ringed with cedar and scrub, and the crumbling remains of logs that have been sitting in the wet for 100 years. And if you stand at the edge and listen, you can hear it. The same low murmur, the same slow breath, the sound of air moving through stone passages that go down farther than anyone has measured, in a rhythm that rises and falls without pattern and without end. The ground is still talking. I don't know what it's saying. I don't know what Amos Creed heard, or what Brother Paulus heard, or what Josiah Webb heard in the dark on his second night in the hollow. I know what they wrote, and I know what the ground sounds like, and the two things are close enough that I have spent a long time thinking about the space between them. The karst ground of Kentucky is hollow. That's not a story, that's geology. The hollow ground makes sounds. That's not a story either, that's air moving through stone. And not all of it is quiet. If you want more stories like this, subscribe. It keeps these old records from going quiet again.